In December 2003, the quiet streets of San Antonio, Texas, became the setting for a deadly crime that shocked the community and raised lasting questions about guilt, truth, and justice. 19-year-old Tommy Garcia Jr., a soft-spoken teenager with dreams of college and family life, was just out with friends on what seemed like an ordinary night. But when he was lured to a secluded area known as Lover's Lane, his life would end in the most tragic way imaginable. Waiting for him were Juan Edward Castillo and a group of friends, a plan already in motion. Prosecutors would later say it was supposed to be a simple robbery, a quick way to get cash. But what unfolded that night would become a cold-blooded killing. According to investigators, when Tommy refused to hand over his money, Castillo smashed the car window with the butt of a gun. Tommy tried to run, but a single shot echoed in the darkness. He collapsed only yards away, dead before help could arrive. The murder was senseless, heartbreaking, and cruel. And when police began piecing together the story, they found a tangled web of loyalty, betrayal, and survival, where everyone had something to lose and even more to hide. At the center of it all stood Juan Edward Castillo, just 22 years old, from San Antonio's South Side. Raised in a tough neighborhood, surrounded by poverty and gangs, he'd been drifting deeper into the street life since his teens. By the time he was arrested, police said he was already known to them, a small-time criminal now accused of murder. For the family of Tommy Garcia, justice meant only one thing. The man responsible had to pay. But the case that followed would divide the courtroom, and years later, the state of Texas itself. Because there was no DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon linking Castillo to the crime. Only witnesses, some of them criminals themselves, and one jailhouse informant who claimed Castillo confessed behind bars. That testimony would seal his fate. In 2005, a jury found him guilty of capital murder. And just days later, he was sentenced to die by lethal injection. What followed was more than a decade of appeals, delays, and desperate pleas. A key witness would recant his story, saying he lied to save himself. But the courts refused to reopen the case. Finally, on May 16, 2018, after nearly 15 years on death row, Juan Edward Castillo was led to the execution chamber inside Huntsville prison. His final meal, chicken patties, mashed potatoes, country gravy, and green beans. Simple, quiet, unremarkable. When asked for any last words, he looked toward the glass and said softly, "To everyone that has been there for me, you know who you are. See y'all on the other side." Moments later, the injection began. He cursed in pain, saying the drug burned his mouth. At 6:55 p.m., he was pronounced dead. To this day, questions linger. Was justice truly served? Or was a man put to death on testimony that may not have been true? To understand how a night of greed and panic turned into one of Texas' most debated executions, and how one man's final words continue to haunt those who heard them, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this isn't just the story of a murder. It's a story of truth, doubt, and the cost of justice in America's death chambers. Before the headlines, before the courtroom, before death row, there were two young men whose paths could not have been more different, yet whose lives would become forever intertwined by one deadly night. Juan Edward Castillo was born in 1981 in San Antonio, Texas, a city divided by its culture, its opportunity, and its struggle. He grew up on the South Side, in a working-class Latino family that tried hard to keep him on the right path. His mother worked long hours. His father drifted in and out of his life. And Juan was the middle child, caught between expectation and the harsh reality of the streets. A friend from the neighborhood would later describe him as smart, funny, and charming, the kind of kid who could make anyone laugh, but who often chose the wrong crowd. By the time he reached high school, he had already fallen under the influence of local gangs, hustling to survive in a world that rewarded toughness more than truth. Those early years shaped him. Teachers recalled a restless boy who was capable of more, someone who might have had a future if only he'd stayed in school. But life in the South Side was a struggle, and the temptations around him, fast money, respect, and reputation, became impossible to ignore. Small crimes soon turned into bigger risks. Petty theft, fights, street deals, each step pushing him closer to a darker path. By the time he turned 22, the system already knew his name. He wasn't a monster yet, just a young man hardened by poverty, peer pressure, and bad decisions. Across town, another young man was growing up with very different dreams. Tommy Garcia Jr. was just 19, a recent graduate with plans to attend community college. He was the youngest in his family, a quiet and respectful boy who loved spending time with friends and playing basketball after work. His mother described him as the kind of son who never wanted trouble, someone who worked hard and stayed out of fights. Tommy had a small circle of close friends and a reputation for helping others. He was known for his gentle nature and his easy smile. That December night in 2003, Tommy was just trying to enjoy a few hours of freedom, a drive around San Antonio, a conversation, a laugh before heading home. He couldn't have known that a chance encounter would put him face to face with someone whose life had taken the opposite direction. Two young men, both products of their environments, born into the same city, but molded by entirely different worlds. One chasing opportunity, the other chasing survival. In another life, their paths might never have crossed. But on that cold winter night, fate would bring them together in the most tragic way imaginable. One man's life stolen, and another sealed by a single gunshot that would echo through Texas for years to come. It was just past midnight on December 3rd, 2003, when a group of friends turned a desperate plan into deadly reality. According to police reports and court testimony, Juan Edward Castillo, along with several accomplices, decided that night to stage a robbery. Quick, easy money from an unsuspecting victim. The plan was simple: use a young woman to lure a man to a quiet, isolated stretch near Brooks Air Force Base, a place locals called Lover's Lane. It was where young couples went to be alone, where laughter and whispers filled the dark, where no one expected violence to find them. That night, 19-year-old Tommy Garcia Jr. thought he was meeting someone he could trust. He drove out to the secluded road in his car, unaware that in the shadows, danger was already waiting. Hiding nearby, Castillo and his crew watched as Garcia pulled in. Their intention, as they would later claim, was to rob him, to scare him just enough to get his cash and leave. But what began as a setup spiraled out of control within seconds. Witnesses later told investigators that Castillo approached the car, armed with a handgun, and demanded money. When Garcia hesitated, Castillo allegedly smashed the passenger side window with the butt of the gun, glass shattering across the seat. Garcia panicked, opening the door and bolting from the car, trying to escape into the darkness. Then came a sound that would haunt the town for years, a single gunshot echoing through the night. The bullet struck Tommy Garcia in the back as he ran. He collapsed on the cold ground, just yards away from his vehicle. The group fled, leaving him there, alone, bleeding, and gasping for life that would soon slip away. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Tommy Garcia was pronounced dead at the scene. When detectives began piecing together the events of that night, the story unraveled quickly. Within days, police traced the crime back to Juan Castillo and his friends. The robbery, they said, was planned, deliberate, and heartless. Prosecutors later argued that Castillo was the one who pulled the trigger, that it was his bullet that ended a young man's life in cold blood. They painted a portrait of a man who wanted control, who chose violence when he could have walked away. From that moment, the case stopped being just another crime on the South Side. It became a tragedy that would divide a community, destroy two families, and set in motion one of the most controversial capital cases in Texas history. What began as a quick score on a quiet road had turned into a murder that would echo all the way to death row. Within just a few weeks of Tommy Garcia's death, San Antonio police had unraveled the chain of events that led to that night on Lover's Lane. After following leads, questioning friends, and gathering statements, detectives arrested 4 people connected to the murder. Among them, 22-year-old Juan Edward Castillo. The others, his alleged accomplices, would each play their own roles in a story of blame, betrayal, and survival. From the beginning, investigators faced a difficult case. There were no fingerprints tying Castillo to the gun, no DNA, and no murder weapon ever recovered. What they had instead were words, the kind that can make or break a man's life. Testimonies from witnesses who'd been there that night, and from one man who claimed to have heard Castillo's confession while they were both locked up in jail. That man was Gerardo Gutierrez, a fellow inmate who told prosecutors that Castillo had bragged behind bars, boasting about shooting Tommy Garcia during a robbery that went wrong. According to Gutierrez, Castillo showed no remorse, saying the boy shouldn't have run. The prosecution built their case around that story, combining it with statements from Castillo's friends, who claimed he was the one who fired the fatal shot. The defense fought back, arguing that Gutierrez was lying to protect himself and that Castillo was being framed as the scapegoat. His attorney pointed out the lack of physical evidence. No gun, no fingerprints, no blood, nothing that conclusively proved Castillo had pulled the trigger. They insisted that others in the group had plotted the robbery and that Castillo wasn't the shooter at all. But in the courtroom, perception is everything. Prosecutors painted Castillo as the ringleader, a young man hardened by the streets, willing to kill for a few dollars. They spoke of his past, his temper, his associations, weaving a narrative of control and cruelty. Witness after witness took the stand, each reinforcing the image of a man who'd turned to violence without hesitation. After days of testimony and emotional pleas from the Garcia family, the case went to the jury. The deliberation didn't take long, barely 3 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read aloud. Guilty. Juan Edward Castillo, then only 24, stood quietly as the decision was announced. His mother wept in the gallery. Tommy Garcia's family held each other tightly. For one side, justice had been served. For the other, a nightmare had just begun. The same jury that found him guilty would soon decide whether he lived or died, a decision that would place Castillo on a path that ended 13 years later inside Texas death chamber. When the trial moved into its final phase, the punishment stage, Juan Edward Castillo made a decision that stunned everyone in the courtroom. Against the advice of his attorneys, he chose to represent himself. He stood before the same jury that had already found him guilty of capital murder, his shackled hands gripping the edge of the defense table, and told them plainly, "You've already decided my fate." It was a bold, defiant act. Some called it courage, others called it surrender. Without legal counsel, Castillo faced off against seasoned prosecutors who painted him as a cold-blooded killer, a man beyond redemption. They described the crime as senseless, the victim as innocent, and Castillo as dangerous, someone who had chosen the path of violence long before that night on Lover's Lane. Throughout the proceedings, Castillo spoke little of remorse. Instead, he maintained that he wasn't the one who fired the fatal shot, insisting that others involved had pinned the blame on him to save themselves. He told the jurors that the system was stacked against him, that his life had been judged long before he ever stepped into that courtroom. But the prosecution's portrayal was powerful. They highlighted his gang affiliations, his troubled youth, and his prior arrests. Photographs of Tommy Garcia filled the courtroom, a smiling teenager, full of life and promise. The emotional weight was overwhelming. Family members of the victim took the stand, describing the pain and loss they'd lived with since that night in 2003. As the jury deliberated, Castillo sat motionless, expression unreadable. Hours later, the courtroom filled once again as the verdict was delivered. On August 11, 2005, the jury sentenced Juan Edward Castillo to death. There was no outburst, no visible reaction. Castillo simply nodded once, quietly telling the judge that he expected nothing different. In that moment, the line between defiance and acceptance blurred. A young man condemned by his choices, his past, and the words spoken against him. As deputies led him away in chains, the camera would linger on his face, calm, resigned, a man who had just heard the final judgment of the state of Texas. For more than a decade, Juan Edward Castillo lived behind the walls of the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, a place known as one of the most isolating environments in America's prison system. Day after day, he woke up in a small concrete cell, confined for 23 hours, his only company the echo of his own thoughts and the shuffling footsteps of other condemned men. From that isolation, he began writing letters to his family, to pen pals, to anyone willing to listen, always insisting that he was innocent of the crime that had placed him on death row. During those long years, Castillo spent time reading, reflecting, and fighting through a system that rarely shows mercy. His appeals moved slowly through the courts, each one raising questions about fairness, credibility, and truth. His lawyers argued that key testimony used to convict him was unreliable, and in 2013, their claim gained shocking new weight. That year, Gerardo Gutierrez, the jailhouse informant whose words had been central to Castillo's conviction, came forward with an affidavit recanting his testimony. He admitted that he had lied under oath, saying he fabricated the confession to help myself, hoping for leniency in his own case. The defense immediately requested a hearing, believing that the revelation could change everything. But the Texas courts denied the motion, refusing to reopen the case. Castillo remained in his cell, his hope fading with each rejected appeal. In interviews and letters, he wrote that the system wasn't just punishing him, it was ignoring the truth. In 2017, just as his execution date approached, nature itself intervened. Hurricane Harvey struck Texas with devastating force, flooding Houston and destroying parts of his attorney's offices. His execution was temporarily postponed, buying him a few more months of life. But the reprieve was short-lived. By 2018, the state had rescheduled his execution date, and despite new evidence of false testimony and pleas from advocacy groups, the courts once again denied his appeals. Inside the Polunsky Unit, Castillo faced the slow passage of time. Birthdays marked by silence, holidays spent staring at the ceiling. He watched as other inmates he'd known were led away, one by one, to the death chamber in Huntsville. He continued to write letters to his mother, telling her to stay strong, and to his supporters, saying he still had faith that someone, somewhere, would listen. But by early 2018, it became clear that the courts would not. The clock had finally run out for Juan Edward Castillo. The state of Texas had set his final date, May 16, 2018. After 13 years of appeals, reflection, and denied hope, the countdown to his execution had begun. May 16, 2018, Huntsville Unit, Texas. After 13 years on death row, the long journey of Juan Edward Castillo was coming to an end. The day began like any other in the unit. Steel doors clanging shut, the shuffle of guards, the quiet hum of voices. But for Castillo, this day was different. It was his last. In the hours before his scheduled execution, he was allowed a final meal, a simple, unremarkable plate of chicken patties, mashed potatoes, country gravy, and green beans. No dessert, no drink request, no grand statement through food. Just one final meal in silence. Outside the prison walls, a small crowd had gathered. Some came to protest the death penalty, holding candles and praying for mercy. Others, members of Tommy Garcia Jr.'s family, stood quietly, waiting for the justice they had been promised more than a decade earlier. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, anger, and resignation, emotions that often collide on nights like these in Huntsville. At 6:44 p.m., guards entered the holding cell and informed Castillo it was time. Calmly, he stood, his hands cuffed, and followed them down the long, sterile hallway that leads to Texas death chamber. Inside, under the blinding fluorescent lights, he was strapped to the gurney, his arms stretched outward, intravenous lines secured. On the other side of the glass, two groups stood in silence, witnesses for the victim and witnesses for the condemned. When asked if he had any final words, Castillo lifted his head slightly and spoke in a quiet, steady voice. To everyone that has been there for me, you know who you are. See y'all on the other side. It was not a statement of guilt or innocence, just a farewell. As the warden signaled to begin, the first of the lethal drugs entered his veins. Almost immediately, Castillo grimaced, cursing in pain, saying that the drug burned his mouth, a detail witnesses would later confirm in their reports. The room fell still as the seconds turned into minutes. His breathing slowed, then stopped. After 23 minutes, at 6:55 p.m., Juan Edward Castillo was pronounced dead. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. The crowd dispersed quietly, leaving behind only the flashing red lights of police vehicles and the hum of evening traffic on the highway. Inside the chamber, the curtains were drawn, marking the end of a life that began in struggle, burned through violence, and ended in silence. For Tommy Garcia's family, the execution closed a painful chapter. But for many who followed the case, questions still lingered about truth, fairness, and what justice truly means. What do you think? After hearing the story of Juan Edward Castillo, a young man shaped by the streets of San Antonio, condemned for a crime clouded by conflicting testimony, did justice truly prevail? Or was this another case where the system failed to uncover the full truth before it was too late? Was Castillo's death the rightful punishment for a senseless killing? Or was it the end of a flawed process that left more questions than answers? His story, like so many others on death row, forces us to look closer at the line between guilt, mercy, and human fallibility. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the death penalty brings justice, or just more loss? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this story thought-provoking, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Crime Report Network, your source for real stories from inside America's most haunting true crime cases. Join us next as we uncover another chilling journey from the courtroom to the execution chamber, where every case leaves behind a legacy and every story demands to be told.